Hi guys, welcome to CADS 3853 module number 11. In the last 6 modules, we've been focusing on markups, right? Starting from basic markup to the 3 different types of markup, and then we concluded with how to average markups and balancing markups. The other side of the pricing besides markup is markdowns, and this module and next module we are going to talk about markdowns. Particularly in this module, module number 11, we're going to talk about how to calculate individual items markdown as well as gross markdown for total merchandise. As a consumer, we all like markdowns, right? Because markdowns are reductions in retail price. Yeah, that means to customer, that means that they are asked to pay less for the same merchandise. For the retailer, that means that's going to be reducing their revenues or sales because they cannot charge as much as the original retail price. Okay? So as a customer, we're probably very familiar with markdowns, and we have zero problem in probably calculating how much is marked down and what's the markdown percentage, or the sales and discount percentage and things like that. But somehow when it comes to try to put ourselves in the shoes of the retailer, it seems like the things become a little bit more complex in our mind, although they are actually the same. Whether you're looking at it from a consumer perspective or the retail perspective, the calculation part is the same. But when we try to put the terminology into the calculation, sometimes we are confused about the terminologies themselves, and that's how maybe things get a little bit more complicated in our head. So let's try to make ourselves clear about the meanings of each term that we're going to talk about from now on, along with the formulas. Formulas are actually pretty simple. As a consumer, you've all been doing this calculation throughout your life. Whenever you purchase anything with any kind of discounts or sales, you've done that, so you know how to do it. It's just that when we try to put them in the merchandising terms, we have to remember what terms, what meaning we are applying to each of these terms. Okay, so the first term we're going to talk about is dollar markdown. Okay, this is an absolutely important term for us to be able to solve any markdown related problems in this class. So the term dollar markdown indicates the difference between the previous retail price and the lower retail price. And we all know this as a consumer, right? How much is marked down? The dollar markdown means by how much, by how many dollars the reduction happened, right? So based on how much it was previously, and now the lower price, how much the lower retail price is, you just take the difference. That will be the dollar markdown. Okay, dollar markdown indicates again the amount of dollars that have been reduced from the previous retail, right, to be in the current lower retail. Then how do we calculate markdown percent? Okay, knowing how much was the dollar markdown, the markdown percent will be the dollar markdown divided by the previous retail, right? So based on the previous retail price, how many percent was marked down, reduced in the retail price, right? So dollar markdown over previous retail. Okay, since we know from the previous formula dollar markdown is previous retail minus lower retail, we can replace the dollar markdown part with that previous retail minus lower retail. So that makes dollar markdown percent equals previous retail minus lower retail over previous retail. Okay, somehow it's pretty clear thing, right? But somehow when we actually come to a very complex markdown problem, we forget about this aspect. And the fact that markdown percent is dollar markdown over previous retail. Sometimes I've seen a lot of students making mistake by using lower retail instead of dollar markdown to calculate markdown percent. So just kind of doing like lower retail over previous retail. That wouldn't be markdown percent, right? Markdown percent is the proportion of the dollar markdown of the previous retail, right? How much of the previous retail was reduced, marked down. And in case we know what the previous retail price was and markdown percent is, then we can calculate dollar markdown by using these two pieces of information, right? As a consumer, we always do this, right? What was the regular price or previous retail price, and then how many percent markdown is applied, and based on that, we can calculate how much has to be reduced, how much less can we pay, right? Just like we can do the calculation as a consumer, a retailer also has to do that calculation. So dollar markdown equals previous retail times markdown percent. Given these the three previous formulas, we can also derive this new formula, which is lower retail equals previous retail minus dollar markdown. Pretty easy, right? If you subtract the dollar markdown from the previous retail, that will tell us how much you need to pay now at the lower retail price, right? So as a consumer, we do this calculation all the time. As a retailer, we again should be able to do that. Sometimes we may need to calculate the lower retail price based on previous retail and markdown percent instead of dollar markdown, right? So when we know how much was the previous retail price and how much markdown is applied, then we know that we have to subtract that dollar markdown from previous retail to calculate lower retail. How do we calculate dollar markdown? That will be previous retail times dollar markdown, right? Markdown percent, I mean. So if you kind of turn that into a formula, that will be that lower retail dollar equals the previous retail times 100% minus markdown percent. Another way of saying it would be that lower retail equals previous retail minus previous retail times markdown percent, right? Because previous retail times markdown percent, that itself, it will be dollar markdown. So you subtract dollar markdown from previous retail, that will be your lower retail, as we already saw in the previous formula. Okay, so we have to remember both formulas. These are rather an understanding about the concept rather than the formula, because you, as a consumer, these are the kinds of things you can easily calculate without even knowing this formula or how to write this formula. But somehow, when we deal with bigger numbers with lots of zeros and multiple groups of merchandise and trying to calculate markdowns and dollar markdowns, lower prices, lower retail, previous retail, and all these kind of things, it kind of sometimes the concept get lost in our head. So we have to just keep our mind really, really straight about these formulas. Among all these formulas, the most important formula or concept that you absolutely must remember is the first one that I mentioned. The dollar markdown equals the difference between the previous retail and the lower retail. Very easy concept, obvious. It's it's something that is so simple that you should not even need a formula. But somehow we, like I said before, seems to more easily forget this one than any other formulas. Okay. So remember that dollar markdown is the difference between the previous retail and the lower retail. And on next slide, we are going to take a look at some simple examples of pricing and markdown cases where we apply all these formulas and see how easy it is to apply these formulas. Alright, so you guys are looking at very, very, very easy example. We're using even numbers. Okay, let's take a look at the first box here. An item with the previous retail of $10. Okay, now let's say now the lower retail of this item becomes $7. Okay, what would be the dollar markdown? I bet you've already done the calculation in your head, right? Okay, what would be the markdown percent? Again, it's pretty easy, right? Okay, as you probably correctly guessed, dollar markdown is $3. And markdown percent is 30%. How do we do this calculation without even using probably a calculator? Well, we instantly subtracted lower retail from previous retail to calculate dollar markdown, $3. 10 minus 7 equals 3, right? So we just know that, okay, $3 have been taken off as a markdown to become now the lower retail price of the $7, right? So that was the number one formula that we saw in the previous slide. Okay, dollar markdown equals the previous retail dollar minus the lower retail dollar. Okay, when we kind of put it as a formula, that sounded a little bit more complex, but in actuality, it's very simple calculation, right? Markdown percent, okay, you probably divided that $3 markdown by the previous retail $10 to get that 30%, right? Which was the second formula that we saw in the previous slide. Markdown percent equals dollar markdown over previous retail. Let's take a look at another example on the second box on the right side. Okay, an item with the previous retail of $10. Okay, let's say now markdown percent is 40%. Okay, in your head, can you calculate what dollar markdown would be? And what would be the lower retail price? It probably didn't take more than a few seconds for you to be able to answer these two questions, right? Dollar markdown will be 40% of the previous retail, so 40% times $10, that will be $4, right? Which was the third formula we learned from the previous slide. Dollar markdown equals previous retail dollar times markdown percent. Okay, the formula is pretty obvious now, right? The lower retail, obviously, previous retail was $10, markdown was $4. So you subtract markdown dollar from previous retail to calculate what the lower retail price is now. That will be $6. 10 minus 4 equals 6, right? That was the fourth formula that we saw on the previous slide. Lower retail equals previous retail minus dollar markdown. Okay, so again, the formula now becomes pretty obvious with this very simple example, right? All right, so let's take a look at the example at the bottom box. Okay, an item with previous retail of $10, markdown percent of 30%. Okay, in the previous box, we first calculate dollar markdown, and then we were able to subtract the dollar markdown from previous retail to calculate lower retail, right? Now, let's say we didn't have an intermediary question asking for dollar markdown. Let's say previous retail was $10, markdown percent was 30%. Let's calculate lower retail from these two pieces of information. Can we do that instantly? Right? Okay. Some of you might have just done what we did previously. So in your head, you calculate the dollar markdown first. Okay, 30% of $10 is $3, and then you subtract that dollar markdown from the previous retail. So 10 minus 3 will be 7. You might have done it that way. Or, okay, we had the last formula from the previous slide when we said lower retail equals previous retail times 100% minus markdown percent. So we applied that. That will be $10 times 100% minus 30% markdown. That will be 7. Either way, it's actually the same thing because the formulas are actually coming from the same concept. Right? I hope this example kind of made things a little bit easier for you to understand. And I hope that you understood that the formulas that we saw on the previous slide are really not hard concept formulas. It is just that you really need to understand the organic relationships among these numbers, the dollar markdown, lower retail price, and previous retail price, and markdown percent. These four numbers, okay? What are their relationships? How they are related to one another, okay? I hope that this problem really helped you illustrate those relationships. And whenever you forget, what the formula is or how to understand the concepts when you deal with big numbers, okay? Always try to remind yourself of these examples. It will be very easy illustration that will let you know the formulas to use, okay, without really thinking about them as formulas. Alright, so let's do one practice problem. We're gonna just do some series of markdown percent calculations here. Okay, Hudson's took the following markdowns on a men's cotton sweater. So this store is taking a kind of series of markdowns on a men's cotton sweater. Okay, the original price was $38. Okay, the first markdown price basically means it's lower price. Okay, first lower price is 26.97. Okay, the second markdown price, that means second lower price, now is 19.97. Okay, third lower retail price was $9.97. Final lower retail price was $4.97. So it's showing a series of price changes that have happened to this cotton sweater. Okay, from 38 originally, it became 26.97, and then became 19.97 and 9.97 and 4.97 eventually. Okay, so then let's calculate what was each of the intermediate markdown percent. So the first markdown percent, second markdown percent, and third markdown percent, as well as the final markdown percent. So there's 4 markdowns that have been taken. Right? Let's calculate all 4 markdown percents. Okay, based on the original retail price. Basically means that markdown percent of the original retail price. That means the original price, $38, will be what we called previous retail in all markdown calculations. For the first, second, third, and final all markdown percent calculation, use $38, the original price, as the previous retail. Okay, so let's work on this problem. Let's pause the video for a while while you're working on the problem. Alright, so we have 4 different markdowns that we need to calculate. First markdown percent, second markdown percent, third markdown percent, fourth or final markdown percent. For each of these markdown percent calculation, we're supposed to use $38 or the original retail price as the previous retail. Markdown percent is previous retail minus lower retail over previous retail, right? Or markdown percent equals dollar markdown over previous retail. Okay, the dollar markdown is the difference between the previous retail and lower retail. Okay, remember that. Some of you might have been confused and might have used the lower retail as the dollar markdown. That would have been wrong. Okay, let's take a look at each answer here. Okay, for the first markdown percent, okay, the previous retail was $38. Okay, the first lower price was 26.97. So 38 minus 26.97 is the dollar markdown. So the numerator portion of this formula is the dollar markdown. Okay, divide that dollar markdown, 38 minus 26.97, by the previous retail of 38. Okay, that gives us the first markdown percent as 29.03%. Okay, second, third, final markdown calculation will be exactly the same way. So again, for second one, third one, final one, all the previous retail should be the original price, $38, minus the second one, 38 minus the second lower price, $19.97. So we have a higher markdown dollar in the numerator of the formula than the first markdown one. Okay, so that divided by the previous retail of $38, that gives us 47.45% markdown. Third markdown the same way, 38 minus $9.97, because the third retail price was $9.97, right? Divided by 30, that's the 73.76% markdown. The final one, now we are selling the sweater for only $4.97, so that will be the lower retail price in the formula. 38, the previous retail, minus the lower retail, $4.97, divided by 38, the previous retail, that gives us the markdown percent of 86.92%. So basically it means we have gone through the markdown. The initial markdown was 29%, and then it went up to 47.45%, and then 73.76%, 86.92%. Eventually, the final price was with a markdown of 86.92%. Okay. The only thing that might have confused some of you might have been the numerator portion of this formula, right? Probably some of you might have been confused and used the lower retail instead of the dollar markdown as the numerator, the dollar markdown portion of the formula. And just be very clear on that. You have to first subtract the lower price from the previous price for you to be able to calculate the dollar markdown. That is a key piece of information, or the key concept, or the key formula that you need to definitely remember related to all markdown problems. Okay, so now that we learned how to calculate dollar markdown and markdown percent for an individual item, okay, let's expand our discussion of markdown to gross markdown, basically meaning the total markdown for all items. Okay, we're taking markdowns of this item and that item, multiple items in our store at the same time usually, right? Then what are the total markdowns for all items? And gross markdown, the term gross markdown is used to refer to the total markdown of all items, regardless of whether these items were actually sold or not. Okay, so that includes all items that had been marked down. Okay. How do we then calculate the dollar gross markdown and gross markdown percent? Just like that, we calculate markdown dollar markdown and markdown percent for an individual item in the previous formulas and example and problems that we saw. We can do the same thing for all items. Okay, so how do we calculate gross markdown in dollar and percent? Gross markdown dollar will be nothing but the sum of all the dollar markdown of all items. Okay, for each individual items, we were able to calculate dollar markdown, right? Dollar markdown was the difference between the previous retail and the lower retail, right? Okay, and so we know we can calculate dollar markdown for each item, and we just add them all up. That will be what we call gross dollar markdown, or dollar gross markdown, okay, or GMD dollar. Okay, if we have to put that as a formula, it would be like, let's say we have multiple groups of merchandise that carry different dollar markdowns. For group 1, dollar markdown was $2. Group 2, dollar markdown was $3. Group 3, dollar markdown was $5. It could be something like that, right? For each group of merchandise that carries different dollar markdown, you can have the number of items that figured out, okay? So that number of items times the dollar markdown for group 1, and you do the same kind of calculation for each of the groups of merchandise that you have, and you just add them all up, okay? That would give us the gross dollar markdown dollar, okay, or GMD dollar. Then the next step will be then, how do we calculate gross markdown percent, right? Markdown percent for an individual item that we saw before was dollar markdown over previous retail, right? And we just extend that concept to gross markdown for total items, all items. So that will be gross markdown percent will be gross markdown dollar that we just saw how to calculate. Divide that by gross previous retail. Okay, gross previous retail basically means the sum of all previous retail dollar of all items. Okay. If you want to have a specific formula for the gross previous retail portion of this gross markdown percent formula, then we would be able to write it something like this. The previous retail dollar, right, times the number of items that carry that previous retail dollar. Okay, that will be the sum of the previous retail of the entire item, all items in that group. And you may have multiple different groups of merchandise that carry different previous retail price, and you just add them all up. That will give us the gross previous retail dollar, right? It's basically the concept is the sum of the previous retail dollar of all items. Okay, the gross markdown was the sum of the dollar markdown of all items. Okay, now gross previous retail is sum of the previous retail of all items. Okay, that gives us the gross markdown percent by doing the gross markdown over gross previous retail. We'll apply these concepts in a problem. Next slide. Alright, in this problem, let's say Macy's Bridge Department marked down 12 Ellen Tracy available jackets from $245 to $149. So that means the $245 was the previous retail price. And now it's sold for $149, so the $149 will be the lower retail price. What is the gross markdown in both dollar and percent on these 12 jackets? Okay, like I said before, any markdown calculation problems, the first thing you need to remember to think is how to calculate dollar markdown. Okay, dollar markdown is the number one concept that you have to consider. Okay, right now we are given the previous retail and lower retail of each jacket, from which we can calculate dollar markdown, right? Do that first for you to be able to calculate gross markdown in dollar, because gross markdown dollar is nothing but the sum of all the dollar markdown of all items, right? You need to have that first for you to be able to calculate gross markdown percent. So you see how dollar markdown is the beginning point of any kind of markdown, gross markdown calculations. Okay, let's work on it. Let's pause the video here for a while to work on this problem. Let's take a look at the answer together. Okay, the first thing to calculate, I said before, is the dollar markdown, right? Okay, dollar markdown is previous retail minus lower retail. So the previous retail of $245 minus the lower retail of $149. That gives us the $96 as the dollar markdown. That means the price had been marked down by $96, okay, from the previous to the lower retail price. Okay, that much was taken off, marked down, right? From there, we can now calculate gross markdown dollar. Gross markdown dollar is nothing but the sum of all dollar markdown of all items. We have 12 items, 12 jackets, and each jacket came with a $96 markdown. So 12 times $96 markdown, that will give us the gross markdown of $1,152. right? We had only one group of items, so we had to do just one calculation like this. But if we had multiple other kinds of jackets or pants or whatever other kinds that came with different previous retail and the lower retail or in different dollar markdown, something like that, and we would have had to calculate dollar markdown for each group of items, and then you time that by the number of items in that group of items. Then you would be able to add them all up to calculate gross markdown dollar, which was what was shown in the formula for gross markdown in the previous slide. Okay, for this question, we have the gross markdown dollar of 1,152. Now let's calculate gross markdown percent from it. Gross markdown percent equals gross markdown dollar over gross previous retail dollar. Okay, now we have to calculate gross previous retail dollar first, right? And I said gross previous retail is sum of all the previous retail dollar of all items. We have 12 items, and each item had a previous retail of 245. So that makes the gross previous retail equals 12 items times 245, right? So that is $2,940 gross previous retail. In gross markdown, dollar was already calculated before, 1,152. You divide that by the gross previous retail we just calculated, 2,940. That gives us the gross markdown percent of 39.18%. So I hope that it wasn't too hard to calculate gross markdown and dollar and gross markdown percent. Now let's continue with the same problem. Let's say the first sentence is the same as the previous problem. So now, okay, the same department had the 12 jackets that were originally 245 and now 149. But let's say none were sold at the reduced price. So that 149, and in spite of the lower price, it just didn't sell. And thus, the department had to now mark it down even further. Okay, so they are now being marked down an additional 30% off of the reduced price. So 30% off of the reduced price from 149, that reduced price, the lower price. Now 30% additionally is going to be taken off. Okay, then what is the new retail price now? The new lower retail price. Okay, then what is the markdown percent now with all this, reduced, even the second reduced price? So calculate the total markdown percent. Okay. Then what is the gross markdown in both dollar and percent on the 12 jackets now with this additional markdown that has been taken off? Let's pause the video here and work on this problem. Okay, first, what's the new retail price, new lower retail price with this additional markdown? Okay, and what's the markdown percent now with this additional markdown? In that case, what would be the gross markdown, dollar and percent? Okay, let's take a look at the answer together. Okay, the new retail price will be now 30% off of the previous reduced price. So previously it was 149. Now 30% off of that, so that would be previous retail 149 times 70%, which is 100% minus 30%. That will be $104.30. Okay, so now $104.30 will be the new lower retail price. Okay, then what will be the new dollar markdown per piece, per jacket? Okay, dollar markdown is calculated based on the previous retail and lower retail, but now it has to be the new dollar markdown based on the original retail, so that will be 245, okay, minus 104.30, the new reduced retail price. That would give us the new dollar markdown of $140.70. Okay, you didn't use just the previous lower retail price 149 to calculate the new dollar markdown. Instead, we used the original retail as the previous retail because, okay, this dollar markdown is the total dollar markdown of this now new price item, right? It's now sold for $104.30. Okay, originally it was $245, so entire $140.70 have been taken off as markdown, right? So that the markdown has to be based on the original retail. Okay, so the new markdown percent will be again the dollar markdown of 140.7, and divide that by the original previous retail, which was 245. So that would give us a 57.43% markdown percent. Of course, it was 30% off of the previously reduced price, right? but from original retail price, it is 57.43% off, right? Markdown. All right. Now let's continue to calculate gross markdown in this case. Gross markdown is the sum of dollar markdown of all items. We have 12 items, 12 pieces, and then the new markdown dollar was 140.7, so we're going to have to use that to calculate new gross markdown. That will be 1,688.4 is now the gross margin dollar, gross markdown dollar. Gross markdown percent is gross markdown dollar over gross previous retail. So that gross previous retail will be the original $245 times 12, which was $2,940, which had been calculated before too, right? So we just utilize the same thing. So 1,688.4 divided by 2,940, that will be 57.43%. Okay. Again, remember that gross previous retail is calculated based on the original retail. So $245 times 12 was the formula to get 2,940 gross previous retail in this case. Alright, I hope you're kind of getting the hang of it now. So now the third problem is here given. Okay, let's say for the Thanksgiving sale, Dillard's Home Department reduced the price of 45 king pillows from $49.99 to $34.99 each, and that of the price of 30 standard pillows from $39.99 to $24.99 each. So now we have two groups of merchandise. One was king size pillows, the other was standard size pillows, right? And 45 king pillows and 30 standard pillows are the two groups of merchandise that we're dealing with here. Okay, and there are previous retail and the lower retail prices are given for each group of merchandise. Okay. So what is the gross margin percent? That's the question. Okay, here we have to first calculate the dollar markdown for each group of merchandise, okay, from which we can now eventually calculate gross markdown dollar. Okay, and then gross previous retail will have to be calculated based on the previous retail price of each of these two groups of merchandise, okay, to eventually reach to gross markdown percent. Okay, let's work on this problem. Okay, let's pause the video here for a little while you guys are working on the problem. Like I said earlier, the first thing you need to calculate is dollar markdown for each group of merchandise. Okay, I strongly recommend you to use this type of setup, the grid that you're seeing right now. This really helps us keep our mind straight again. I mean, you don't have to utilize this, but it just helps, and it helped me a lot, so I think it will help you guys a lot too, especially when we deal with multiple groups of merchandise. And you know that as a retailer or merchandiser, line planner, designer, you are not dealing with only one kind of merchandise, but you're dealing with 100 styles at a time and 1,000 SKUs at a time. So it is most important for us to be able to kind of put things in a kind of spreadsheet format, and this is the way it is. Now, given the information that we already know, okay, let's try to plug them into the right place so that we don't miss any information and we can easily calculate markdown dollar. Okay, we have two groups of merchandise. Item group is the first column, and then the quantity that were available: 45 king size pillows and 30 king standard pillows. And then for each of these pillow group, we had a previous retail and lower retail that was given in the problem. Okay, so $49.99 was the king, or a previous retail or original retail, and now lowered to $34.99. Standard started with $39.99, and now it is sold for $24.99. Okay, so for each case, we should be able to calculate the dollar markdown for each individual each king and standard pillow. Okay, how do you calculate that? That's right. Dollar markdown is the difference between the previous retail and lower retail, right? So subtract the lower retail from the previous retail. For both cases, it was $15, right? $49.99 minus $34.99 was $15. $39.99 minus $24.99 for standard size, that will be again $15. So for both cases, we happen to have $15 dollar markdown equally. Okay. And the next step will be to now calculate gross markdown dollar. Okay, gross markdown dollar is the sum of dollar markdown of all items. and in this case we have two groups of items, king and standard. Okay, we can calculate gross markdown for the king and then gross markdown for the standard, and we add them all up, right? For king, dollar markdown was $15 times 45 units were available. Okay, standard $15 dollar markdown times 30 units available. So that gives us $1,125 gross markdown for both king and standard pillows combined. Now let's calculate the denominator part of the gross markdown percent formula, which is gross previous retail. Okay, in this case, it's gross previous retail is the sum of previous retail dollar of all items. Okay, again, we're looking at group by group. The king pillow group, the previous retail was $49.99 times 45 units. Okay, standard, we had the $39.99 previous retail times 30 units. Okay, you add them all up, that would be $3,449.25 gross previous retail. So given the gross markdown dollar and gross previous retail dollar we just calculated, we can easily calculate gross markdown percent. Gross markdown percent equals gross markdown dollar divided by gross previous retail dollar. So 1125 divided by 3,449.25, that gives us the gross markdown percent of 32.62%. I hope you got it right. Alright, so this concludes module number 11. In this module, we've only taken a look at the individual items markdown calculation as well as gross markdown, which is the kind of total markdown of all items, whether they were sold or not. In next module, we are going to continue this markdown discussion, and we're going to think about a little more complex scenarios where some items were sold with markdown, other items were not sold with markdown. You know, in that kind of cases, you know, the items, even if you had the markdown, some of the items might have not been sold, and then they might have had to return back to their original price. You know, that kind of more complex cases, which is more realistic in the real world retail problems. All right, thanks for listening, and don't forget to work on module problem assignment number 11 before you start the next module.